Welcome back to Conversations with Consequences, now on EWTN Radio. I'm your host, Ashley McGuire.
And I'm Betsy Fentress.
And we are thrilled to have our TCA chaplain with us today as we mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, remembering what was at the heart of that document and the foundation of faith that we have etched into our country's birth and our many great American saints. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, Monsignor.
It's great to be with you, Ashley. Great to always be with you, Betsy. It's a rare opportunity when we're all having the same time together. So I'm super excited to be able to have this conversation as we approach our 250th birthday as a nation.
Well, I've just marked two separate, very exciting Catholic things. The first was I was at the Becket Fund dinner where Pope Leo sent an address to attendees that was read in the shadows of Independence Hall. And then I just returned from Boston, where we spent some time showing our kids the origins of the American story. And I was reminded, actually, that despite the narrative that this country was founded on religious freedom, there was actually a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment at the American founding. And yet the church, now we have an American Pope. But can you tell us a little bit about those first American Catholics who came here, what they were up against, and their contribution to expanding religious liberty to Catholics?
So there was a notion of religious liberty, but it was narrow. It was only toward the ones that they wanted to have religious liberty. In a lot of places, Catholics were not extended the same thing that was extended to those who had left England precisely for religious liberty purposes. When we look at the Catholic origins of the country, it's always super important for us not to just focus on the Northeast. And we can clearly do that in the state of Maryland, for example, with the Carols. But we have to look to Florida, where the first Mass would have been in the diocese and city of St. Augustine, where the Franciscan missionaries had landed, and that the faith was planted there. We likewise have to remember what St. Junipero Serra did on the west coast of our country, coming up from Mexico and founding all of these missions to spread the faith there. That was happening before the events that were marking the 250th anniversary at this time period. And so we've really got those three settings, and then we've got the work of the North American Martyrs coming down from Canada, and three of whom dying in upstate New York and Auriesville, St. Isaac Jogues, St. Jean de Lalande, and St. Rene Goupil. And St. Tekakwitha began to grow there. This was over 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. And so there really is a Catholic history here that often most Catholics don't know, and we need to be proud of, that we started to lay the groundwork for what eventually would have become the United States of America through the prayers that were made by the first Catholics, through the sacraments that were celebrated, through the witness, and even through the blood of the first Catholics on these shores. And so we're going to be marking later on this year not only the beatification of Fulton J. Sheen in St. Louis on September 24th, but on October 31st, we're going to be marking the Franciscan martyrs of Savannah, Georgia, who died in 1597. And their blood, the blood of the North American martyrs, the prayers, the efforts of all of the first Catholic saints have had an important role in the flourishing of Catholic faith in our country after the Declaration of Independence, and particularly over the course of these last 150 years, where the church was organized enough to be able to make a real contribution to the flourishing of our country.
Senator Ben Sasse was accepting an award at the Manhattan Institute recently, and he made a comment about how anti-Catholic John Dewey was in relation to education in the United States. Talk about the role that the Catholic Church has played in education and the founding of parochial schools and the bigotry that they faced.
Because the government schools were anti-Catholic, because they were first and foremost serving a clientele that came from anti-Catholic groups, And then a lot of the teachers were likewise of those religious groups. Catholics needed to do it on their own. And the parents thought that the most important thing of all is making sure our children receive the light of the fullness of the Catholic faith. And so, at great personal sacrifice, most built Catholic schools before they even built their Catholic parishes, so that their children would be able not just to learn how to read and how to write and how to add and subtract, but so that they could learn their Catholic faith well. And so we developed the greatest Catholic school system in the history of the church in any country. That because of the immigration here and the need to make sure Catholics were going to learn in um, uh, according to their entire being, including their soul, including to their faith. We founded the Catholic school system. It was St. Elizabeth Ann Seton was one of the first. She founded the first women's religious order to teach Catholic schools and opened up the first free school for girls, for example, which was serving all children. But then eventually the Catholic school system in the early 1800s in Baltimore. And likewise, St. John Newman, the fourth bishop of Philadelphia. Now there are archbishops of Philadelphia. He really built up the Catholic school system there, such that the Archdiocese of Philadelphia's Catholic school system was the greatest in any diocese in the history of the church, and it still is really formidable. That's what allowed the Catholic Church really to grow, because so many different women's religious communities and male religious communities were working in Catholic schools where they had an opportunity not just to prepare Catholic students for excellence in different fields, but also to integrate their Catholic faith into whatever their profession would be. And so Catholic schools are a super important part of the history of the church in our country, and something that's made the United States much stronger. And it's something we can't take for granted. The first Catholic wisdom was such that government schools were not really serving their children effectively. And that has become the problem anew. We just can't finance Catholic schools because of our capacity for sacrifice to make these schools successful. In the early days, it was $50 per head and for a family to go to Catholic schools, because the religious who were running the Catholic schools were living under the vow of poverty. And so in many cases, they weren't compensated at all, or they were compensated very poorly, including with health care, including with retirement benefits, including things like this. And when we've had a decrease in the amount of religious vocations, we've had to pay lay people small salaries compared to what they can get in public schools. And a lot of the times, even with those small salaries, we can't make ends meet because they're just not able to do it off the tuition income coming from the poor families that are sending their kids there. There are different dioceses that do this totally different. That the Diocese of Wichita, Kansas, has a stewardship model such that it's free for Catholics to go to Catholic school in Wichita, and the parishes pay 70% of that Catholic school's budget. When that happens, there's no surprise that Wichita is teeming with vocations to the priesthood, to religious life, to marriage, etc., that they're doing very, very well ecclesiastically because they've received a really profound Catholic education, and that the whole church shows its value of Catholic education by the amount that they sacrifice for it. And so we could return there again, but that's something where it's got to be led by our appreciation for Catholic schools. And I long for the day where priests, religious, and lay people love the children of the church enough to be able to do whatever it takes to provide a really solid Catholic education for them, because there's no greater gift we can give to our kids and no greater foundation we can lay for them than an authentically Catholic education.
Well, I certainly will never take for granted Catholic education. And for me, a big part of that was the COVID pandemic and the way that Catholic schools stepped into that scary void of we're opening. And it was so clear when all the public schools were shut down, it was so clear it was because they were mission driven in a way that the public schools are not. And that really defines not just Catholic schools, but Catholic institutions, another one of which we can't take for granted are hospitals. And, 1 in 7 hospital beds in this country are at a Catholic hospital. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the Catholic Church really pioneered our modern day hospital system and still does. So talk a little bit about St. Francis Cabrini and what Catholics did to pioneer healthcare in this country, especially during times of terrible disease. I mean, I'm just finishing Elizabeth Ann Seton's biography, and the amount of just malady and disease that people had to live with, and a lot of unknowns. And the Catholics were just fearlessly at the forefront, helping all people, not just Catholics.
St. Francis Xavier Cabrini was in the news because Pope Leo last weekend visited her birthplace in Italy. He gave some beautiful remarks about her. We remember that Pope Francis said she was his favorite saint, and she
Mm.
needs to be known by every American Catholic. Her tomb is in New York City. I visit her place often, and I'm always taking Catholic visitors to go and pray at her tomb. She was a huge problem solver when she came. When Pope Leo the 13th said not to the East, not to China, but go to the West, and she showed on up, she found Italian immigrants in great squalor. They were really suffering. There were 200,000 Catholic Italian immigrants here living in ghettos. There were only 12 priests, 11 of whom had been kicked out of Sicily and Lower Italy for crimes. So they weren't really getting the best of pastoral care either. And she came in first. She did an orphanage for the kids who were living off the streets. That was an immediate need. Out of that, she started to found a school system. Out of that, she started to build hospitals because people didn't have the money or the resource to be able to go into the hospitals that were founded elsewhere. She never planned to form a religious community that could run all of these types of things. She was just trying to respond to what God was asking in the moment with regard to the needs. And she ended up going to many different countries, 67 different Catholic institutions, from Catholic schools to Catholic universities to Catholic hospitals to Catholic social service ministry. Whatever was needed, she sought with her community to provide. And so she fit in very well to American culture because American culture has always been entrepreneurial. And she's one of the greatest entrepreneurs in the history of the church. Like a typical entrepreneur, she saw unmet needs and she founded something to meet those needs. And the types of needs she met were among the most important needs. And so 3 cheers for St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, who is the only American in the niches inside St. Peter's Basilica. She's
Mm.
looking at the altar where the Pope continues to celebrate Mass, as well as the altar of the chair, where the Holy Spirit comes down upon the church, because she truly was a woman of the Spirit whose motto was Omnia possum in eo qui me confortat. I can do all things in him who strengthens me. And so she was such a woman of prayer. She received the strength from God in prayer and the sacraments. And boy, did this diminutive Italian flex those spiritual muscles with all that she built. So we give her thanks. She's one of Hall of Fame of American saints that is going to be added to this fall with Blessed Fulton J. Sheen and the Franciscan Martyrs of Georgia.
So much of the American story is immigration and people who came through Ellis Island, and both the religious who served and the people that they served. What in the 20th century, what do you see as the church's mission regarding immigration as part of our American Catholic heritage?
So we know that in the 1700s, but particularly in the 1800s, there were these mass movements of Catholics coming to the United States. At the time, we had Irish, we had Italians, we had various Eastern Europeans who were all coming on over in search of a much better life. And they were greeted by the Statue of Liberty, by those extraordinary words of come to me with basically all your burdens, that we were open and that we were grateful for the way that they wanted to come on in and make a difference. Some of the times they received some blowback by those who considered them others, but eventually they found their niche. They built up strong parish structures, which strengthened the cities. With the education, there was upward mobility. And then there was huge patriotic love on the part of Catholics, that Catholics became involved as the police officers keeping order, as the firemen to make sure that places weren't going to be destroyed, eventually founding universities and trying to help Catholics get some terminal degrees, then serving in our military. Catholics volunteered in great number out of love and gratitude for our country. And so they strengthened the main institutions of our country that have allowed us to flourish, because we can only do that in a situation in which there's some type of governmental structure. And the Catholics were always present there. And likewise, it's unsurprising that eventually Catholics were running for public office and serving us in public office, being elected in cities and in states, and eventually in Congress and in the Senate. And then we've had two presidents likewise elected who have been baptized. This whole notion that Catholics were not going to keep their faith to themselves, but they were summoned by Jesus himself to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world, and a leaven that lifts all society up. Catholics took that seriously, and their formation in the faith overflowed their parish boundaries into the neighborhoods, into the cities, into the states, and into the nation that they called home. And so huge waves of immigration over the course of our becoming the leading country in the world in economic factors, in terms of influence, in terms of military, all the rest. That was on the backs of very hardworking Catholics. And that has got to be a lesson for us. We Catholics have received a lot from this country, and therefore, just like God called the Israelites who had been freed from Pharaoh to remember the widows and the orphans and all those who are immigrants and things like this, so God says, remember, once too, you were suffering and you came to these shores. And what's going to be your attitude to new waves of immigrants who likewise look at America as the place where some of their dreams for themselves and for their families are able to be fulfilled? And so we need to have an open heart, which doesn't mean that there's no border, which doesn't mean that we can accept an unlimited amount of immigrants. There can be proper regulations so that migration can be safe, orderly, and regular, as the church has emphatically taught. But we have to start with that heart. And because of the greatness of our country, we do have a capacity to absorb many and to integrate them so that they're able to continue to remind us of our first love, of our dreams, how we've been able to fulfill many of those dreams in our nation, and how many others are coming here to be able to recapitulate those beautiful stories for individuals, for families, even for their neighborhoods, in their companies, in our states and country, as we begin to integrate them better. And so when we look at the history of the saints in the United States, we start with a lot of immigrant saints who came here and really built up. We've already discussed St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, the North American Martyrs, St. Junipero Serra, but we could likewise say St. John Neumann, Blessed Francis Xavier Seeloss. We can similarly talk about those who came down from Canada, Saints Isaac, Rene, and Jean. We can talk about and then we can talk about those that we exported. Blessed Stanley Rother, Blessed James Miller. This has become a place not where just Catholics have lived and gotten integrated, but where the fullness of the Catholic life has shown in those who have made that eternal Hall of Fame. And so as we celebrate these 250 years, it's great for us to be grateful for the Catholic saints, to invoke their intercession so that we can follow in their footsteps, and their continued prayers that our country be able to live up to all the hopes and the dreams of those who over the last 250 years have called this place home.
Well, we just have 1 minute left, but if if somebody were listening and thinking, how could I find out more? Where's a good starting point to find out more about any saint, or just what's a good resource for somebody looking to learn a little bit to grow their depth of the understanding of the Catholic contribution to the American founding and subsequent centuries?
So there are various historical books about the growth of the church in the United States. The author I'd recommend would be Monsignor John Tracy Ellis, who tells that story in a very easy way. That's where I'd begin if you're looking for one place. If you're looking to do a little bit more inspirational work, I'd encourage you to just pick up the lives of some of these American saints, see how they responded to the challenges and questions and opportunities of the age with faith in Jesus Christ, they're the ones who are able to teach us how to adapt to our own circumstances and make it stronger, thanks to the way that together in tandem with Jesus, we can do all things in him who strengthens us too.
Well, we didn't even get to the unfolding chapter, the next chapter of American Saints, Fulton Sheen. So we'll have to save that for another day. But Monsignor, we thank you so much for all your wonderful insights on this topic during this patriotic week where we're celebrating our country and our faith's role in our country. Thank you,
Happy
Monsignor.
250th birthday, Ashley and Betsy.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Monsignor.
Welcome to Conversations with Consequences, now on EWTN Radio. I'm your host, Ashley McGuire, is Andrew Laubacher, whose presentation on his digital detox went viral at the Seek Conference earlier this year. Andrew, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So this is a topic that everybody's talking about, and as I said, and it's something I personally care about, have written about. I have 5 kids, 2 of them are teens, so we're in the thick of, trying to hold screens at bay. But tell us, why, from your point of view, is reevaluating our relationship with technology so important right now?
I think before diving into the weeds of all the problems that are unfolding, which are vast, and we can talk about this for 17 hours, I think it's first good to understand how we got in this predicament. And the reality is, and Gaia Bernstein talks about this in her book, Unwired, but we've essentially been given these products without our consent, right? No one was asking for Facebook. No one was asking for Instagram or TikTok or even the smartphone. These were products that were given to us without what's called any precautionary principle. So in science, you're supposed to look at these possible trade-offs of implementing a new technology or product and see what the negative outcomes could be before releasing the product, right? Now, with the smartphone, the ease and convenience of all of these tools in one place was so exciting. When it first came out in 2007, it was like amazing, right? All of a sudden you could email and text and you could talk to people, and it was this cool, sleek new product. And we didn't know that there was going to be a vast amount of trade-offs from being accessible at all times, from being able to view the world in the palm of your hands. We had no idea what social media was going to do. And obviously access to things like pornography and gaming addiction, and now a huge problem is unfolding with the gambling and gaming combined into these different platforms, right? So I think it's first good to acknowledge and to allow people to experience the compassion and the mercy on ourselves, knowing that as parents and as people in the 21st century, we did not know that these products were going to be incentivized by large tech companies to exploit vulnerabilities in our human psychology, right? The name of the game of the attention economy is just that. It's gaining your attention. That's how they make money. So these products aren't free. They're actually costing us a lot. They're costing us our relationships, our purity, our attention spans, our social connections, our connection to God, right? So there's a lot unfolding there. And at the same time, there can be real tools that are in these technologies that can be beneficial for humans. So a huge part of humanity's mission is to help people get that intentionality back in their lives with their tech, and also get out of the trade-offs of a lot of these platforms.
So what is your approach to a digital detox? Break that down for us.
Yeah, so in our program, we created this 12-week program. You go through this detox. What I'm unpacking with technology is way more vast than just the screen and specifically social media. It's all of it, right? Technology is a computer. Technology is a fork. The pencil is a technology, right? Your car is a technology. The light bulb is a technology. So in our program, the detox is really comprehensive in addressing the whole person. So these 11 humanality ways that I created are the antidotes to the trade-offs that are happening with technology in our lives. So I'll give you just a few examples. So for example, one of the first episodes is called Be Free. There are 11 B's, right? So in Be Free, we go into all the addiction science that's unfolding, that I can say with a high level of confidence that we are in real addiction level science in regarding our technology. It's playing on neural pathways in the brain that look the same under fMRI studies that drug addicts look like. Wow. So there's real implications. Just because it's not something you're ingesting doesn't mean it's not affecting your neurological wiring, right? So in Be Free, we go into all the addiction science, how these tech companies are purposely addicting you to their products. And once you start to understand that this, again, isn't happening by chance, this is by design, you're not as willing to give away your time and attention to these platforms, right? So in Be Free, we give you multiple ways to break free just from even understanding how these technologies work, right? So a really basic equation that these tech founders use is under a psychological school of thought called behaviorism. And within behaviorism, you have thinkers like B.F. Skinner, if you've heard of the Skinner cages, and these other tactics that have this like cue reward trigger cycle. So, right, you hear the notification, bing, you see in the feed, you get the dopamine hit, and then you get the reward. Now, there's multiple studies, one particularly called Facebook Depression, that actually showed that as time increased, as users increase their time on screen on these platforms, their increase in mood disorders, specifically anxiety and depression, doubled. So we know now there's real dose-dependent relationship with these technologies. The more time you spend on them, the more likely your risk of anxiety, depression, and many other disorders are happening, because technology is changing everything, right? So Neil Postman wrote about this in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985, and simply said this, quote, "A new technology doesn't just change this or that, it changes everything."
Great. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Ashley.
Welcome to Conversations with Consequences, now on EWTN Radio. I'm your host, Ashley McGuire, and we are thrilled to have back with us the one and only Megan Cox-Gurdon, who has been sounding the alarm on the importance of reading to children for many years now. Her critically acclaimed book, The Enchanted Hour, really speaks to the power of reading in an age of distraction. Welcome back to the show, Megan.
Well, thank you for having me. It's wonderful.
So your book, The Enchanted Hour, was written back in 2019. And fast forward to 2026, it seems like your advice has become even more timely as there's more and more research coming out about how we really are living in the age of distraction. What have you seen change in the years since you've written the book?
Well, what I've seen change is pretty much what you, I think, have seen, what we've all seen. I mean, my book was written before the pandemic, when many of us were still struggling with, addiction to screen time, or if not addiction, but, kind of being drawn to our screens, away from each other, away from our own families, away from the people who are in the room with us. And that was pretty notable, in 2019. And then comes the pandemic. Everyone's locked in at home, and school goes online, social life goes online, and the kind of barrier to entry for children and parents being on their phones all the time. Now, I say phones, I use that loosely to mean screens. Those barriers to entry just dropped, and we all became habituated, I think, to finding, comfort and succor through the screen. And so, yeah, I would say the greatest change that I've seen is that we are all even more deeply distracted than we were in 2019.
Right.
And I think also the culture of reading aloud with children is undergoing some stresses. There are some young parents are finding it, because they themselves are habituated to being on screens and finding their pleasure through screens, are finding it more difficult to set aside time. I mean, I hear this anecdotally, to set aside time with their young children, and therefore they are not getting the benefit of that quiet but productive time with their children, and the children not getting the benefit of the quiet productive time with their parents. So, what we can do is we can just tell, if people know, what I try to say in the book, and which we've talked about before, if people knew how good reading aloud was for them, if it were a pill, everybody would be having a prescription, right? So
Right.
We can't take it by pill form. We have to take it the old-fashioned, old school way, sitting together and reading together. And we can do it, but you have to kind of know about it. There was a time maybe in American history where it was axiomatic. People just read together all the time, and they would know the benefits from experience. Well, we don't necessarily know those benefits so well anymore. So it's always a good idea to remember what is good for us. I mean, many of us have to be reminded to drink water. I mean, how basic is that? So we
It's such a good point. And you mentioned the pandemic, and we very early on just completely opted out of online learning. And one of my best memories of the pandemic was reading Anne of Green Gables out loud with my then 8-year-old daughter. And I was struck by how much I benefited from the book, how much I loved rereading that book, especially as an adult. Last time I had read it was as a child. However, since the last time that we had you on the show, my husband and I have made a more concerted effort to read out loud, especially with our older kids. We're pretty good about doing it with our younger kids, but I have to say, it is a real struggle to find the time, to fight for the time. So, can you talk about what is it about reading out loud that's different than just say sending their kids to their room to read quietly? What is it about reading out loud? Because that's your unique angle here.
Yeah, well, when we read aloud, we bring all sorts of different domains together. So there are things that happen. There's how can I break it down? So the written word is something that is, we have to learn how to read it. And you talk about children reading alone in their rooms or whatever. That's lovely. But when somebody reads the written word out loud to another person, they're giving them a kind of gift. The written word is sort of floating through the air into their ears, and it becomes very easy to follow a story when you're sitting with someone who's reading to you. But you don't have to work at the words. And it's not to say that reading, is some kind of arduous task that people should be gotten out of doing. It isn't really that. It's more that you can experience language in a rich, full way when you have the experience of just hearing it float into your head naturally, which is how we all learn language. It's how we all pick up on things. And you described reading Anne of Green Gables to your daughter. What you gave her there was you gave her beautiful writing. You gave her an adventure in a place that you both went to together. She was able to conjure in her mind images of what the old radio people used to call the theater of the mind. You would put the words there for her, and she would draw the picture in her head, and all of that is very productive. It's very meaningful and a very rich way to encounter one another. There are other things about reading aloud. There is a kind of chemical shift. I mean, perhaps we've talked about this in the past, but when say a parent and child, but it doesn't just have to be a parent and child, two people sit down to read together, there's a kind of emotional shift that takes place, so that hormones that produce closeness, such as oxytocin, go up in the body. The hormones that produce feelings of stress, that make us feel agitated, these decrease, and it's a measurable shift. So there's a sense in which, by sitting together with a book, we are engaging with one another in a very personal and intimate way that uses the book as the vehicle for connection.
That's beautiful. Well, we're heading into summer, and for a lot of burned out kids, I think they're thinking, this is when I'm going to veg in front of the TV. And even for burned out parents, this is when I'm not going to have to be writing my kid about homework. But what is your advice to parents who want to be purposeful about their kids' summers? And sure, kids get the summer reading list, but who want to make reading, both reading out loud and reading to oneself, truly an integrated part of their summer?
So I love this idea, and I'm so glad that you're proposing this to families. I think summer is the perfect time because it is this discrete period of time. There's not the same, like the school rush in the morning. There's not the commute. There's no homework. I mean, there's usually some homework, but there's not the homework, the usual
Right.
homework. And it's a wonderful kind of, it's what, 3 months they get off, something like. It can be a wonderful test period to start a new habit. So actually, in the Enchanted Hour, there's the final chapter actually begins and ends with a test family that I had. This family with 3 children agreed to be my guinea pigs, and they did not read aloud. They were a very screen-based family, and they had an elder daughter who was kind of orderly, and then 2 very rambunctious little boys who couldn't focus and didn't really know what books were. And one of them, the middle one in particular, was certainly old enough to be able to look at books and get something out of them, but they just weren't habituated to it. And I used a pseudonym. I called them the Rashid family. That was not their real name. But the great thing is they decided at the beginning of the summer, this would have been the summer before the book came out, to to implement reading aloud, is how the mom said. We're going to implement reading aloud every day. We're not going to ask ourselves if we're going to do it. We're just going to do it for 10 minutes, something very small. I mean, I encourage them and I would encourage any family listening. You don't have to be heroic. You don't have to start with an hour. You don't have to, I mean, you don't even have to do it every day, although I would recommend, like any habit, if you want to develop a habit and get the real benefit of it, you do it reliably. And what the Rashid family did was they would decide in the morning when they were going to read that day. And it might be, when they get back from the pool, or over dinner, or during bath time, or at breakfast. It's really any time is read aloud time. Often when children are a little contained, especially if they're young and they're rambunctious, in the bath, say, or while they're eating, it's a pretty good time to pounce on them and read to them. And the effects on this family were stunning. I have to say, I am a true believer in reading aloud. I was amazed by how the change in this family, by the end of the summer, they had been really conscientious about it. They had read every day. And I walked back into their house at the end of the summer, and it was measurably, I say measurably, I didn't measure it, but it was palpably, it was calmer, more orderly. The baby in particular, who was 2 at the time, had been throwing books in the beginning of the summer. By the end, he was crouching over them in that cute little toddler way, with his diaper showing, just looking through the pages of books. Like, they were just, these children, the family culture was transformed by reading aloud. And these children, especially the young boys, were calmer, more focused. Everything that the parents had hoped might come from reading aloud, they had got by dedicating the summer to doing it. So I have to say, this was a real test case. It really happened. I really recommend it.
Wow, that's great. Well, to initiate that, you need dedicated adults. And I have been struck by a lot of the research that's coming out showing that adults increasingly don't read, or are struggling with some of these same struggles that we've been reading about with children in terms of distractibility. We're all on Twitter. Twitter is clearly affecting our ability to focus. Everything from shorts, and everything has to be made into video shorts. And there was an article that went viral a couple weeks ago about dads, I think, and how dads aren't even reading anymore. So how do adults get back into the habit of reading? Because if they're gonna lead their family on this journey, they have to be committed themselves.
I would say, I mean, it's like anything. If you want to do something, you actually have to do the thing.
Right.
But I don't think, I remember that article about the dad books, and I believe that the discussion was that dad books, which are, those big histories that you
Boring
give dads
history
for
books,
Christmas
yeah.
or whatever,
Right.
that dads are now getting their history fixes from podcasts, and it's a little bit more challenging for the publishing sector. But I would say reading aloud, or reading with children, or even reading spouses reading to one another, you don't have to have young children at home to do this and get the benefits of it. Or if you have, it could be anybody you're reading to, your elderly parent or whatnot. Reading aloud together, that could be the entry point for grown-ups as well as for children. And then there are wonderful stories. For instance, let's say you were to read fairy tales, okay? Or folk tales from, pick your culture that you might want folk tales from. You want Korean folk tales, or Chinese folk tales, or Norwegian or Norse folk tales, not Norwegian. These are stories that come to us from the mouths and hands of adults. Fairy tales were not originally children's stories. They were stories for everybody. Aesop's fables, similarly, it's not baby stuff. It's foundational literature. And that's why we now think of it as something that's very good to read with children. But these are stories with a lot of kind of dynamic complexity, and they are interesting to the adult mind as well as to the child mind. And so if, let's say, you're a family and everybody's been on their phones and you think, gosh, let's get back into books, do it together. Do it over something that might seem childishly simple, like Aesop's fables. Those stories are rich in precept, rich in analogy and allusion, and we see their echoes all over the place. And these books are resources for adults as well as for children.
It's so true. I remember my son, and maybe we discussed this story the last time you were on the show, but it was summer, and he had come home with a gift from his school. He's not at that school anymore, but it was one of the Dogman books.
Oh
And
yeah.
I think that was their idea of like, let's get off on the right foot with summer reading. And I took it and I swapped it out for the first of the Narnia series. And it was unbelievable to see the way he plowed through those books. So can you talk a little bit about I think, misperception that childish books are books that are, there's this genre of like books that are geared towards children, but they clearly aren't succeeding in captivating children because the literacy rates, the reading rates are all just tanking. And I don't think it's entirely screens.
I think you're right that screens are not the only culprits. There's a sort of another cultural element of work here. There's very strong desire, it seems, maybe it's a good commercial desire, maybe very sound, for book publishers to produce books that meet children where they are. This is one of the phrases that's used in the industry is we're going to meet children where they are. Well, where are children, right? They're they think dogs farting is funny, whatever. And okay, it is objectively funny, but that's not just because that's funny. You might get a one-time laugh out of a child reading a book about. There is obviously a whole series of books about Walter the farting dog, but there's a cultural problem of pandering to children, but also not expecting very much of them, meeting them where they are at an undeveloped level and not lifting them up to something greater. What you found with your son and the Narnia books is a beautiful demonstration of that. If you give children something rich to chew on, it's more interesting for them than something that can be just gulped and swallowed in one bite. It's just, I guess that's probably true for all of us. We do respond to short, easy pleasures. It's one of the reasons why we like to be on our phones, for instance, because we get instant pleasurable feedback from them. But to really feel as though you've done something. Okay, here's an analogy for you. You know what it's like when you go, you make the effort to get to a museum, which can seem like a lot sometimes, depending on the house and whatever. And then you're exposed to high, beautiful, sometimes demanding art. And somehow you are replenished in a deep way from an encounter like that. And that's what complicated literature will do for people as well. Richness of language, richness of story and characterization, and things not all being pat and smooth and easy and perfect, but having little rough edges. That it's very enriching. It's I don't know. I'm going in a circular way on this point, but I do think that's right. We have a bit of a problem with our culture is feeding people fast and delicious, bites of literature, television, video, whatever. Maybe not television. It's kind of an old medium now. When in fact, what really sustains us is deeper connection, deeper engagement.
And so, for parents who are maybe like this test family that you described, who may not be, we send our kids to these wonderful schools where literature is so emphasized, and there's just a steady conveyor belt of wonderful options that are presented to us. And, I have a resource that I sometimes consult, A Mother's Guide to Books by Teresa Fagan.
Oh,
But
yeah.
for parents who are maybe new to this, you go into a public library now and it's just kind of everything on display is garbage. And I remember the public libraries used to even have sections that just feed, and some probably still do, like Newberry, Caldecott, where you could just be like, okay, I'll go here, skip everything else. But what do parents do who are trying to find that richer material and avoid the pitfalls of, Diary of a Wimpy Kid and Dogman and things like that?
Fun fact, Diary of a Wimpy Kid was actually originally written for the adult market.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There's some clever humor in there, but it's not.
Oh, definitely.
It's not what I would call rich sustenance
It's
material.
not rich sustaining literature, no. So I would say parents who are, have children in schools where literature is not emphasized, or who themselves don't have much of a home library and don't know where to begin. I would say there are two things that they can do. One is to avail themselves of the reading lists of the schools that you mentioned, sort of that, you can often find if you know of a school, you might not have been able to afford it or get your child in there, but often the reading lists per class are available at some of the really fine private schools. And that's one place to start. But the other thing I would say is, you can always go back to foundational stories. It's a great way to begin exploring literature. And again, I would say fairy tales are just this fantastically rich resource. The fairy tales and folk tales have not modern retellings necessarily, although some of them are very funny and nice. Mac Barnett recently retold Rumpelstiltskin, for instance, in a way which is quite charming. But go back to the old fusty originals as far back as you can go. There's the wonderful Andrew Lang series that they're all the fairy books with colors, like the blue fairy book and the green fairy book and the orange fairy book. They're just fantastic resources full of stories that are strange, but also stories that have been told so long and so well that they are structured in such a way that they engage, the human imagination. I don't know why that is. I don't know how that is, but it just happens that way. Folk tales, as distinct from fairy tales, are often stories that people in pre-media cultures would tell, sometimes about the guy in the neighboring village who he was so strong he could do whatever, and the story gets told and passed down and honed and perfected and improved. So even while a story might have a very specific geographical origin, it becomes a story of a kind of everyman available to everybody, sort of folktale by after a couple of generations of retelling. I think those are a great place to start. I mentioned Aesop's fables before because I just think there's such good stuff in these books, and we can sometimes forget how good they are and how they enrich your understanding. I mean, of just how people behave. Now, human nature has not changed, and Aesop told his stories using animals as stand-ins for humans. But I would say the two resources that are available to families that are easiest, if you don't have a home library and you don't know what to get out of the libraries, go back to the beginning, read foundational stories, and check the reading lists from the schools where you admire their curricula.
Well, we've talked a lot about screens, and I love the quote from Jonathan Haidt's book, Anxious Generation, where he talks about how children today are underprotected online and overprotected in the real world. And this is a topic very dear to my heart because I have 5 children and I'm trying to raise them to be independent and to use freedom responsibly, but it's hard in a world where, people love to call child protective services on kids for playing in their front yard. But you have a book coming out about this called Free Range Girl. I'm very excited about this book. Can you give us a little sneak peek of the book and what inspired you to write this?
Yeah, definitely. So my book is not really about the phenomenon of free range childhood. I'll leave that to the experts like Jonathan Haidt and Lenore Skenazy of Let Grow, the organization that tries to help parents like you and parents as I was, to give their children some freedom of, some risk, some freedom and reward that you get, because as Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have pointed out so well, children are anti-fragile.
Yeah.
They actually benefit from a little adversity. I mean, obviously we don't want to, we don't want terrible things to happen, although, you got to take some risks. So maybe a terrible thing will happen now and then. But Free Range Girl is really about my own experience. It was about my experience going back to the land with my father in 1976, 77. By Back to the Land, that was a whole movement where people wanted to leave city life and for various reasons settle in the countryside and work with their hands and raise their own vegetables and grow their own animals and that kind of thing. So a kind of homesteading movement, such as been popular in American history from now and again. And it was a big thing in the 70s. So in 1976, in those days, I'm an only child, or I was an only child. My father subsequently had 2 other children, but I was growing up an only child from a broken home, as my father used to put it, in kind of mock sympathy. I don't think he was very sympathetic, actually. So Free Range Girl is really, it's my attempt to capture the experience of what it was like back in the world before any screens except television screens. There weren't even, there were computers, they existed, but most of us didn't have anything or had no concept that they were coming to be part of our lives in 1976, 77. It was a completely different world. And so in Free Range Girl, what I do is I describe what it was like for me going back to the land with my dad at the age of 12 to live on a homestead that he was building in Maine with his own hands. He built, he built, when I say with his own hands, I mean it. He didn't have any power tools except
Wow.
for a gas-fired chainsaw, but everything else he had to use hand tools because there was no electricity where we were. So he built this extraordinary, farm with a menagerie of animals that we had, and I got to live there with him, and it was the ultimate free range experience. I describe in the book how, sometimes obviously if you take risks, you are going to have some negative things happen, and some negative things definitely happened. There was one incident when I was presented with a gas stove and didn't know how it worked exactly, and blew my eyebrows off. And there was another experience where I spent a week in the hospital after riding bareback on a horse that panicked. And so, there were some ups and there were some conspicuous downs, but it was a very rich time. And one of the really striking contrasts to me between then and now, one of the reasons I really wanted to go back to that time was not only the amount of freedom that children had, freedom and responsibility. We all had jobs, we all had chores, but we could also just go places and do things. But life was very tactile back then, and it was much less mediated than it is now. And I see the childhood that is going on, of my own children and now my own grandchildren. There's just much more mediation. So we, in the 70s, if you wanted to turn something on, you had to crank a knob or press a button or pull a lever or something. But there was no swiping, there was not this smooth screen and this fast response from things. Everything was kind of mechanical, kind of clunky. There were a lot of smells and textures. You used your hands a lot. It's just a vanished world. So what I really wanted to do was to write down what it felt like. And I dedicate the book to my grandchildren, George and Philip and Lucy, because them coming into the world now really made me reflect on the world of then.
That's beautiful. Well, I really look forward to reading that. And thank you so much for coming on today to help us try to launch Summer Off Right for our listeners. Whether you have children or not, it's never too late, as I think you're one of the ones who's pointed out, it's never too late to pick up a book and start living a life that is blessed by the richness of literature. So Megan, where can our listeners find your work, and who's publishing your book? Where can they find your book when it comes out?
Okay, so there are various places you can find me. I write for the Wall Street Journal books pages. I also write for Free Expression, which is the Wall Street Journal's, it's run by the opinion section of the Wall Street Journal. It's an online newsletter that can be easily accessed. Go to Free Expression and there's you can get a free subscription to that. I write there every couple of weeks. I also have a website, megancoxgurdon.com, and that has information about where you can buy The Enchanted Hour, and also a link to, I'm not sure how many links there are yet for Free Range Girl, but it's coming out in October. My publisher is Morehouse of Free Range Girl, and October 20th is when the memoir will publish. Pre-orders are available now on Amazon. And of course, every author loves people who pre-order because it makes an immense difference in the prospects for a book if there are pre-orders. So I would treat everyone listening to consider pre-ordering Free Range Girl. Yeah, that's it. And there's a link that I can be found through my website. You can contact me directly through the website.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Megan, for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's really fun to talk about this.